The human mind is extremely impressionable, especially during its early years of development. However, by the time you're 18, most would argue that you are really no longer impressionable. That being a common misconception, as the brain actually continues to develop, at least physically until you are 25, but it doesn't stop there. The average person is constantly learning new things every day, and the brain continues to retain new information, albeit it does get a bit more difficult. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that because the human brain is so impressionable, it is easy to understand how movies, specifically horror movies in this case, could leave a lasting impression on some viewers, so much to the point that it could cause some to commit terrible crimes. Before we go any further, I am not trying to say that horror movies cause people to commit crimes, because I genuinely think that idea is pretty insane. However, I am not going to sit here and say no one is inspired by these films to commit some crimes, because by the sole point that I'm even making this video, you would say that I am lying. Although, I do believe everyone should understand that horror movies don't create killers. They make them more creative. But I digress. The following are some crimes that were inspired by horror films. Do you want to play a game? The Saw franchise started as a small budget film made by a couple of film students who had access to limited resources and a single room. As most should know by now, the franchise has spawned 7 films, and an 8th soon, under the title Jigsaw, that will hit theaters this October. The horror series follows a deranged killer, Jigsaw, who murders people who don't appreciate their life, and for some revenge in some cases. The main draw of the horror film, though, is that it is a gore fest, filled with grotesque, though original, kills. He traps a victim, and then proceeds to ask them, "Do you want to play a game?" Then, more often than not, the victim is put into a life or death situation, where they have the chance to save themselves by abiding to the killer's rules, and proceeding to beat him at his own game. It would be surprising to hear that someone would recreate the situation in real life, but you'd also let me introduce you to Beverly Dixon. One night, Dixon got a message on her phone that started with a sinister message: "I want to play a game. You need to decide if your life is worth living for," and proceeded to tell Dixon that her friend was tied up in the house, and the house was going to get filled up with toxic gas. So essentially, she would risk saving her friend or saving herself. Unable to handle the pressure, she had a stroke and collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but she managed to pull through. Unbeknownst to Dixon, none of her friends were actually tied up, and no one was planning to fill her house with poisonous gas. Apparently the call was so frightening that Dixon still had trouble sleeping through the night. Anyway, the 2 girls were charged with phone harassment and were each fined $2,000. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. The Nightmare on Elm Street is definitely one of Wes Craven's, may he rest in peace, best horror franchises. It was a great hit when it initially released in 1984, and continues to be a hit and a fan-favorite horror film today. It introduced us to one of horror's most iconic baddies, Freddy Krueger, and for backstory's sake, Frederick Charles Krueger was a citizen of Springwood, who lost it one day and proceeded to become a serial killer. His targets? Children. He killed by the dozens, with his trademark claw glove, until he was caught. As a side note, he also acquired the nickname the Springwood Slasher. Regrettably, he was pronounced not guilty because of a technicality. Furious, the parents of his victims chased him down to a shack behind the power plant he worked at, where he was burned alive, which gave him his disfigured features. Rather than actually die, he was given the chance to kill again, and became a dream demon. From then on, he would enter the dreams of his new victims and kill them in there, which would then kill them in real life. So, how could someone imitate such a paranormal killer? Well, they can't. Meet Daniel Gonzalez, a 25-year-old with a history of mental illness. Daniel was infatuated with Freddy, and practically idolized him. He was even quoted in saying that he fantasized about being an infamous killer like Freddy. He initially wanted to kill 10 people, but only managed to kill 4. His murders took place within 3 days, a killing spree which he would later describe as purely orgasmic. His victims included 76-year-old Mary Harding, 46-year-old Kevin Malloy, and an elderly couple, Derek and Jean Robinson. He would plead not guilty in court by reason of insanity, but was then given a 6-life sentence. He would later go on to commit suicide in his holding cell via a makeshift blade. What's your favorite scary movie? Scream is definitely one of mine. I'll be bold enough to say, I think the Scream franchise is my favorite and the best horror series out there. And it was a pretty impactful one too. Yet another of Wes Craven's hits. The first Scream movie was a box office hit when it first released in 1996. The film was so successful, it spawned 3 sequels and a TV series on MTV, with a 3rd season coming out on March of 2018. Focusing on the movie franchise, it follows Sidney Prescott in all 4 films as she constantly has to confront a new serial killer donning the mask of the original Ghostface from the first film. In an effort to avoid a lot of spoilers, here's a quick synopsis of the first film. Sidney Prescott was a teenager in Woodsboro, who after some murders around her neighborhood, starts to piece together that the murders may have something to do with her. It's up to Sidney to not only survive the murderous killer Ghostface, but uncover the truth behind his killing spree. Onto the actual murder inspired by the film. Unfortunately, this is another case of murderous children. Gina Castillo was a 37-year-old loving mother. One night, while she was cooking, her son, 16, and her nephew, 14, snatched a knife from the kitchen counter, and when Castillo wasn't paying attention, the 2 boys proceeded to stab her. She was mortally wounded, but still had enough strength to call 911. On arrival, she was rushed to the hospital, where she was regrettably pronounced dead, and the 2 boys were promptly arrested. When questioned by the police, the 2 boys confessed to the murder, and were cited in saying that they committed the murder because they needed enough money to fund a murder spree. Apparently, the boys wanted to reenact the first 2 Scream movie storylines, and were even going to use Castillo's credit card to buy a Ghostface mask and voice changer, just like in the films. You know, it's Halloween. Everyone's entitled to one good scare. Halloween, another great horror series to greet the big screen. This series has a lot of movies under its belt. There are a total of 8 films, not including the remakes, which will total for 10, and an 11th is currently in the works. Again, as a side note, the original was released in 1978. The original 8, minus the 3rd, follow Laurie Strode and her conflict with series antagonist Michael Myers. The original and the 2007 remake follow a similar storyline, beginning with 6-year-old Michael Myers brutally murdering his 17-year-old sister, Judith. He was quickly sentenced and locked away for 15 years. However, one October night, October 30th to be precise, he was being transferred to a court date. The then 21-year-old Michael Myers managed to steal the transport vehicle and return to his hometown of Haddonfield, Illinois, where he was in search for his new victims. One night, Jake Evans, a mentally ill 17-year-old boy living in Texas, became enthralled with Michael Myers while watching the 2007 remake. He became fascinated by Michael Myers' composure as he murdered his family, and was even more amazed at the lack of remorse he had. Jake, now having watched the film 3 times that week, decided to follow in Michael's footsteps. Jake grabbed the family gun, loaded it, and then continued to shoot both his mother and sister. In utter shock, he ran to his room and began to cry, for what seemed like hours, he describes. In his tears, he kept ranting on about how messed up he was. He initially thought it would be easier to kill someone, because Myers did kill people so easily. Regrettably, he was wrong. Sadly, and perhaps the most horrific part of this case, through his sobbing, he heard movement coming from his sister. He went over to her body, aimed the gun at her head, apologized, and took the shot. He then shot his mother once more, just to make sure she was dead too. He then revealed that he planned to kill his grandparents too, as well as his 2 other sisters, but fortunately for them, he couldn't do it under the immense confusion and sadness he probably felt over the whole situation. He was then sentenced to 45 years in prison. The actions of the people who committed these crimes are nothing less of deplorable. However, as you noticed, everyone on this list was either extremely young and between the ages of 13 to 25. As such, these people were extremely impressionable. It's just something I think I should point out, in an effort to not put the blame on these horror films, because again, I don't think horror films are to blame when it comes to murder or crimes, as they aren't the ones who caused them. I mean, why give another excuse to opponents of horror films to continue to hate on the industry? With that out of the way, let me leave you with this little factoid. Did you know, the term horror wasn't used to describe the genre until the 1930s?